Hello! This is part 2 of my response to the alternative hypothesis. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you check that out since this video will be a continuation of that. I'll link the video in the description if needed. But without further ado, let's get this thing rolling. So first, alternative hypothesis talks about predatory lending. For those who don't know, there was a practice predominantly in the early 20th century where housing lenders would spread fear of black people moving into a white neighborhood in order to get whites to move and sell their homes at cheap prices. These same lenders would then sell these homes to black people at much higher prices than they're worth. Let's see what alternative hypothesis has to say about this.
I don't know what to do about this. Like, a fool and his money are soon parted. I don't know what your solution is for this. Do you want to have for every black person to have some sort of minder to tell them how to manage their finances? I don't know what your solution to this is supposed to be.
Well, I'm glad he conceded that predatory lenders use racism to scare people out of their money and to put blacks in poorer neighborhoods. In terms of solutions, I don't know, maybe crack down on the predatory lenders? Like, is he seriously defending people who swindle others out of their money simply due to the fact that there might not be a 100% clear solution to it? Even if there wasn't a clear solution, one, that doesn't make this not an ethical wrong, and two, it doesn't mean that it didn't have an effect on black families. He later goes on to talk about how neighborhoods were so nice until the blacks moved in. This relates to the whole argument about blacks and crime, which I addressed in part 1. So you can go and check that out if you want. For now, I'm going to move on. Next, alternative hypothesis goes on to parrot white nationalist pseudo-history.
When the 1910 ordinance was overturned, Baltimore's mayor created an official Committee on Segregation, which cooperated with neighborhood associations to pressure landlords in white neighborhoods to sign covenants committing them never to sell or rent to black residents. These agreements were enforced through strategic building and health code citations issued against owners and by evictions of black renters who violated the covenant.
Now, Contrapoints just says this like this is some terrible evil, but this is literally what all countries do with outsiders.
But blacks weren't outsiders. White people had been bringing them over since the 16th century. Also, this is a red herring. Just because there are some other countries that do this to quote-unquote outsiders, that doesn't make it morally justified.
And none of these white people here ever agreed that blacks were their countrymen.
It's not up to them to agree. Blacks back then were Americans who grew up in America. How white people felt at the time does not change that.
Prior to general emancipation, there was not a single majority black neighborhood in Detroit or Philadelphia. Those blacks were not segregated. These were the blacks who earned their freedom prior to the end of slavery, and so we can surmise that they were higher quality people than the general black population.
Earned their freedom. I love the portrayal of slavery by this guy. It's as if he literally thinks that if you worked hard enough, you could be free, so free blacks must have been hard-working, good blacks, and the ones who stayed enslaved must have been bad anyway. Like, this makes no sense though, because if anything, hard-working blacks would have been more likely to stay enslaved, since they were the ones who made a larger profit for the slaveholder. And many freed slaves got their freedom through escape, or through their owner releasing them after death. It had nothing to do with free blacks being better.
And objectively, we know that the anti-black laws in northern cities didn't take off until general emancipation, until whites came into contact with not just the talented 10th blacks who earned their freedom prior to the end of slavery, but the average blacks who were not able to do so. And it was this experience that caused the whites to start to erect both legal and outright physical barriers between them and the blacks.
No. Anti-black attitudes from white northerners started long before they came into contact with the average black, as evidenced by the fact that segregation in the North existed far before the end of slavery, when blacks actually started to begin moving north en masse. For example, in most northern cities, wealthy blacks were prohibited from living in white neighborhoods, even before the end of slavery. Once you think about this argument for more than 2 minutes, you realize it's complete bullshit. He claims that as whites have more experiences with blacks, they become more racist. But then why is it the case that pretty much after a century of cultural interaction and experiences with blacks, there are demonstrably less racist white people than probably existed in the 19th century. If experiences with blacks led to more racism, the exact opposite would have happened. Like nowadays, we live in a much more culturally diverse society than we did, say, 100 to 150 years ago. According to alternative hypothesis here, we would expect more people to be more racist today than they were back then. But this obviously isn't the case. Now, let's talk about alternative hypothesis's claims regarding slavery.
On top of that, black slaves, once in the US, they actually worked about 400 fewer hours per year than free white farmers did. We know this from how much a white person worked per year, and we know how much free white farmers produced in that time. Blacks are assumed to be equally productive per hour, and they produce less per white person per year.
Well, one of the sources he cites in his blog, Olmsted and Road, literally explained that when we notice a rise in output from free farms and northern farms, we notice an increase in the capital to labor ratio and an increase in the machine power to labor ratio. However, for slave plantations, both ratios don't change much as a function of output. What does this imply? Well, it implies that larger outputs from free and northern farms generally were the result of the industry being more capital intensive, while increases in output from slave plantations were reliant on increases in the labor force, or acquiring more slaves. Now, you calculate that slaves worked fewer hours because they produced less per person per year. However, what I'm demonstrating was that free and northern farms were able to produce more per laborer since generally they were able to improve productivity through more capital intensity and machine power, while slave plantations generally only increase productivity through acquiring more laborers. Here's what Olmsted has to say, and I quote, "In summary, large cotton plantations differ from free farms because the plantation total capital to labor ratio does not increase rapidly with scale. They also differ from free farms and manufacturing establishments, including factories, because the plantation power and machine intensity does not increase rapidly with scale." End quote.
There was also a natural experiment that replicates this, done by Trevon Logan and his family, where they manually sewed and picked cotton without any mechanization, and the amount of cotton they produced on their little family farm was very close to that of historical yields during slavery.
Whoa. He's severely misrepresenting the Logan study. The Logan study wasn't an experiment conducted by Trevon Logan and his kids, but rather he analyzed the cotton output from his family's sharecropping plantation in 1952 and compared that to the output of slaves under the gang system. Already we can see why Logan's family, in the 1950s, produced 90 to 95% of the output that slaves did. They were on a sharecropping farm, a fact that he conveniently leaves out. For those who don't know, sharecropping is a system where a landowner allows someone to live and work on their land in exchange for a share of the output. Usually the landowner would receive 50 to 66% of the output. This became prominent in the Reconstruction South, as recently freed slaves were essentially penniless and were desperate to find a way to make some money, and this context made sharecropping one of the only options for many of them. Sharecropping was notorious for its exploitative nature. Landowners had a tremendous amount of leverage compared to the sharecropper, since if the sharecropper didn't produce enough, the landowner could threaten to not renew the lease, thus rendering the sharecropper homeless. Oftentimes, the sharecropper really didn't have the resources to go out and sell that much cotton, so they would be in contracts to sell their landlord the extra cotton, which meant that sharecroppers would often be subjugated to manipulated prices, thus meaning that sharecroppers often remained poor. This remained prominent even going into the 20th century. The Logan study specifically mentions that the children working on the sharecropping farm worked from dawn until it became so dark that you couldn't even see the cotton anymore, similar to the accepted number of hours worked by slaves under the gang system. So it's no surprise that they both produced similar amounts of cotton. Along with this, the Logan study specifically mentions that failure to meet quotas usually resulted in beatings, even for the children. It's no surprise they produced similar amounts, since both were extremely exploitative. The fact that slaves produced slightly more than another very exploitative system isn't an argument for his side. If anything, it's an argument for me. Let me read to you a quote that Logan found from one of the books he used for his data that really highlights the brutality of sharecropping. You was in a place, and you had a place, and you didn't leave that place. You couldn't speak up for yourself. If you didn't shut your mouth about how you was treated, they would shut it up for you. They killed Dad's brother, laid him on a railroad track, and then they were gonna say it was a suicide. But they killed him as sure as the day is long. And Dad and his brothers knew who did it. They couldn't do nothing about it, or they'd have been killed too. Think about that. You know who killed your brother, and you can't do nothing about it. Nothing. That's what it was. You kept your head down, and you worked, and you made sure you didn't step out of line. Your life was at stake. I'm starting to notice a disturbing trend here. Alternative hypothesis quite consistently doesn't understand the evidence he's using. Now, in earlier cases, I chopped this up to sloppiness, maybe he misread something. But this instance goes much deeper. Like literally, the very first sentence of the study says, and I quote, I used the individual level records from my own family in rural Mississippi to estimate the agricultural productivity of African Americans in manual cotton picking nearly a century after emancipation, from 1952 to 1965. It later says, the cotton picking books retained by my deceased paternal grandparents are quite detailed and allow me to estimate the individual productivity of 9 children whom were involved in intensive manual cotton picking from 1952 to 1965. This rich quantitative data forms the basis for this study. Hell, the title of the study is literally A Time Not Apart, a lesson in economic history from cotton picking books. So the only way he could have innocently come up with this notion that Trevon Logan did an experiment with his kids on a family farm was if he didn't read a single word of the study. However, I know he's read at least some of the study because he literally shows you screenshots from tables from it. Hell, the title of the table he cites literally says, The Productivity of Logan Children, 1952 to 1965. And enslaved children, 1850 to 1860. So if he's read at least some of the study, and yet still says that this was an experiment done on a little family farm run by Trevon Logan himself, the only explanation is that he's lying. He is a liar. Mr. Hypothesis, I want to ask you, why are you lying to your audience? Why? If you even have a shred of academic honesty, you'll put out a video apologizing to your audience for misinforming them. Although, I have my doubts that you'll do that.
Blacks in the Americas almost certainly would have been slaves within Africa if not for the Atlantic slave trade. And there's a few ways we can infer this. The first is that the slave trade within Africa was about 9 times that of the Atlantic slave trade at the time of the Atlantic slave trade.
Okay, assuming that his calculations for the number of slaves whom lived in Africa at the time are correct, it's still a faulty comparison for 5 major reasons. 1. He compares the total number of slaves in Africa with the number of slaves brought to the Americas both between 1500 and 1850. Now, the problem is that the number of slaves brought to the Americas is not the same as the number of slaves whom worked in the Americas. To name one example, only about 388,000 slaves were brought to the United States from Africa, but by 1860, the slave population was around 4 million, the increase being due to natural population growth. So he's leaving out a good chunk of the number of enslaved Africans in the Americas by only looking at the amount brought from Africa. A total of about 12.5 million Africans were brought to the Americas during the Atlantic slave trade. Unfortunately, calculating the total number of slaves whom lived in the Americas would be nearly impossible considering the natural population growth rates and the life expectancy of slaves varied wildly by region and time. But overall, the point still stands that the total number of slaves in the Americas would probably be significantly higher than 12.5 million. 2. You also have to remember that many died right after capture. Some estimates range from 4 million to over half of those intended for American markets died during the march to the coast of Africa. 3. Alternative hypothesis needs to put this in perspective. The advent of the Atlantic slave trade, along with the slave trade to the Muslim world, fundamentally changed the global dynamic of slavery. Before the Atlantic slave trade took off, African slaves made up a minority of all of the world's slaves. Afterwards, the vast majority of the global slave population were African. It essentially spread African slavery to a global scale, something that wouldn't have happened without the slave trade to Muslims and Europeans. This leads to another point. Slavery in Africa, while obviously still bad, didn't lead to global race-based disenfranchisement that slavery in the Americas did. While slavery in Africa did sometimes have an ethnic basis, in general, slavery in Africa did lead to a global underclass of people whose sole axis of disadvantage was simply being black. The slave trade essentially played a large role in creating a world where almost no matter where you go, Africans will be disadvantaged. Furthermore, historian Patrick Manning, who looked at the demographic effects of the African slave trade, found that, and I quote, "A cumulative total of 10 million Africans reached the New World as slaves between 1500 and 1900. Closer to 12 million were dispatched in ships from Africa. In that same period, 6 million were sent from sub-Saharan Africa to the Orient, and some 8 million were enslaved and retained in the African continent." End quote, all mainly as a result of the slave trade. He also states that, and I quote, "In 1790, there were some 3 million New World African slaves, and were perhaps the majority of all black slaves." He goes on to explain that the population of African slaves in Africa only exceeded New World slaves by 1850. And lastly, that rates of capture increased in most regions of the African continent from the 16th century to the 19th century. This directly contradicts his claim that African enslavement didn't increase during the slave trade, and thus slaves in America would have been slaves in Africa. So, estimates from a blogger on YouTube versus estimates from an accredited historian. I'm going to go with the historian. Now, obviously, don't take my word for it. Go read the paper by Patrick Manning. It's actually really interesting. I'll link it in the description. 5. Even if he doesn't buy any of the 4 previous arguments, also remember that just because other people kept slaves along with Europeans, that doesn't mean that Europeans no longer have blood on their hands. Europeans were still a facilitator of African slavery in the Americas. Post hoc rationalizations like slavery happened in Africa too doesn't absolve the Europeans at the time for what they actively participated in. Also, one more thing to keep in mind. African slavery varied wildly, but in general, slavery in Africa wasn't usually the same as slavery in other parts of the world. Slavery in Africa would have been more akin to debt slavery or serfdom. But I'm not going to include this in my reasons to reject his argument since 1, I think all slavery is bad, so it doesn't really leave a good taste in my mouth to be defending one type of slavery over another, and 2, again, slavery in Africa varied wildly, so any characterization such as this would be dangerously overgeneralizing. But overall, y'all get the point. We already have 5 reasons why we would reject this comparison as being an apt comparison.
And this was true until the continent was taken over by Europe. Right? It was Europeans who stopped slavery within Africa.
Well, kinda, but only after expanding it to much of the globe. Also, don't paint European imperialism as some sort of benevolent conquest. 1, Europeans were very selective where they abolished slavery. For example, Portugal in the late 18th century abolished slavery in some of their colonies, but seemingly maintained slavery in Brazil, their American colony. Why? Well, slavery in Brazil was still really profitable for them. Europeans maintained slavery until it wasn't really profitable anymore, or once they had been sufficiently pressured to give it up. It wasn't due to Europeans having a higher sense of morality. 2, this characterization takes away the agency of slaves. Numerous slave rebellions happened throughout the course of the slave trade. They were the original ones fighting for abolition, not Europeans. He's essentially outright ignoring the thousands, if not millions of people who risked their lives for their freedom. 3, even after European colonization, they essentially maintained slavery all but in name. For example, in the Congo Free State, millions of Congolese were essentially made to work in rubber extraction for Leopold II. Failure to produce enough rubber was punishable by death. In regards to the death toll, it ranges between 6 and 10 million. Along with this, between 1904 and 1907, Germany outright murdered 80% of the Herero and Namibian people in what's essentially a genocide. A major contributor to this fact was that many were put in forced labor camps, which, for all intents and purposes, is slavery considering the forced labor, and many died as a result. Overall, forced labor was, in general, very common in colonial Africa, even after the abolition of slavery. I'm putting links into the description if you want to read more about this. They didn't call it slavery, but that doesn't mean it wasn't. He also mentions later that Europeans abolished slavery around the world, including outside of Africa, but again, they still practiced it all but in name. The British maintained a system of indentured servitude where 3.5 million Indian folk were sent all across the British Empire in what was essentially a system of forced labor and exploitative migration. In Australia, Aboriginal children were confiscated by the Australian and British government and were forced to assimilate and were subjected to child abuse. The Aboriginal population in Australia declined by 87% after colonization. During the late 19th century, the rulers of Latin America were still predominantly of European descent, and during that same time period, about 90% of the indigenous population that was still around died due to forced labor and rubber extraction. This fucker even goes on to say that other countries outside of Africa should be grateful for Europeans since they abolished slavery in their countries. Yeah, tell that to the 300,000 people who died in a man-made famine in German East Africa in 1905 in order to silence dissent. Tell that to the tens of millions who died due to man-made famines in British India. Or how about the millions of indigenous people in the Americas who died due to forced labor or disease? Should they all be grateful for European rule? If you honestly think that, you have an absolutely broken moral compass. After recording this part, I got the feeling I wasn't being very nuanced here, so I'd like to make a clarification. He's technically correct. Rates of enslavement did decline during the process of European colonization. But the thing I want to contest here is that he, at least in this video, makes this out to be some sort of benevolent liberation that everyone should be thankful for, when, in reality, Europeans subjected the colonized to brutal practices of their own, and like I said earlier, practiced forced labor, all but in name in many cases. The way he describes the abolition of slavery around the world fundamentally ignores the earlier complicity of Europeans in the slave trade, along with the atrocities that came as a result of European conquest. He's essentially giving you a whitewashed version of a very controversial historical event.
We also know this from the inelasticity of supply. Basically what this means is that an increase in the demand for slaves always resulted in a several order of magnitude increase in the price of slaves, which is evidence that the slave traders could not increase the supply of slaves in response to any increase in demand.
All this would mean is that it took a long time for supply to meet increases in demand, but that doesn't mean that the overall amount of enslavement didn't increase at all during the 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. All that would really mean is that the increases would have had to been really gradual. All this means is that the market took a long time to react to increases in demand, which would mean an increase in prices, which makes sense considering the nature of slavery. Remember, Africans went from being a minority of the global slave population to the majority.
And today, even though blacks are actually slightly shorter than whites today, this is something a lot of people don't know, during slavery, blacks were actually slightly taller, which is evidence that they had better nutrition back then, or that they weren't required to work at as young an age as white children, or some combination of factors that made them taller than whites, even though, based on modern height, they're not genetically predisposed to being any taller than white people.
Well, other than genetics, nutrition is one of the biggest factors when it comes to height, but few are saying that slaves were on the brink of starvation. If anything, in order to do all that work, they had to have been fed somewhat above the bare minimum. That being said, they still weren't fed all that well, nor was the food very nutritious. An analysis of the available evidence by Ramiro Guzman indicates that slaves, while not on the brink of starvation obviously, generally didn't have very nutritious diets. Also, we have accounts of slaves having to resort to planting their own food crops in order to meet food requirements, so if anything, that's evidence against the idea that they were reasonably fed by slave owners. But like I said, I'm fine conceding that slaves weren't on the brink of starvation because, I would agree the evidence is against that.
Okay, let's go through the next thing. On the rape of black slaves, that's another slavery trope. Thaddeus Russell from A Renegade History of the United States says, quote, "But among rural slaves, which made up 95% of the slave population, only 9.9% were mulatto. Of the slave population as a whole, mulattoes made up only 7.7% in 1850 and 10.4% in 1860. Moreover, only 1.2% of the former slaves interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reported being raped by a master. Only 5.8% reported hearing about the rape of another slave, and only 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. The share of Negro children fathered by whites on the slave plantations probably averaged between 1 and 2%. Even Fogel and Angerman's most hostile critics concede that it was no more than 8%. There's also evidence of a significant number of consensual relations between white men and slave women, which would make the percentage of children produced by rape even smaller. And Thaddeus Russell didn't say this, but I will. 1 to 2% of black women saying they were raped by white men, all that means is 1 to 2% say that they were raped by white men. And if they were politically savvy, they would have a political reason to say that, even if it were not true.
Okay, I have 4 responses to this. 1. He says they had a reason to lie about being raped, but actually no. Back then, blacks who spoke out against injustice were prime targets for harassment and ridicule. If anything, back then they'd have an incentive to lie in the other direction, saying that they hadn't been raped when they had, in order to avoid persecution. 2. He also ignores the double standard of laws at the time. Black men being accused of rape were usually put to death or castrated, however, white men could rape their slaves with no fear of punishment. In fact, black women were also barred from ever defending themselves from such abuse, which leads me to 3. Consensual here is a tricky phrase. I wouldn't have a hard time believing that many slaves openly agreed to have sex with their masters in return for certain benefits, but that hardly counts as consent given the power dynamic at play here. It's hard to say no when you're in a precarious situation such as enslavement, and having sex with the master is going to be the one way in which you can get on their favorable side, along with the fact that saying no usually resulted in beatings and defending oneself was against the law. 4. The Works Progress Administration numbers are so low, likely because the interviews were conducted in the 1930s. Why is this important? Well, that means that the people interviewed must have been slaves when they were really young. For example, if somebody was born in 1860, just 5 years before the end of the Civil War, they would have been in their 70s by the time the interviews rolled around. Most of the interviewees would have been young children when emancipated, so it's no surprise that many weren't raped or didn't hear about rape. 5. A Renegade History of America is a pop history book. I wouldn't use it as a source. There's a reason why Thaddeus Russell isn't really well respected in academia, and it's because he's a bad historian. I can't give you an exact percentage on the amount of slaves who were raped during slavery, since that would be extremely difficult, but in order to believe the 1 to 2% figure, that would require you to ignore pretty much all of the primary and secondary sources on this issue. Along with this, we have DNA evidence. Admixture seems to have been extremely common before and during the Civil War, and then suddenly drops off at the end of the Civil War. I wonder why that might be. I'm linking to a study in the description. Now, of course, just because there was lots of admixture during and before the Civil War, and it drops off after the Civil War, doesn't necessarily mean that these were the result of rape. But in that case, I refer you back to argument 3.
For the corporal punishment stuff, look, there's no data on that. We know of one guy who kept records on corporal punishment, Bennett H. Barrow, but you can't infer anything.
Well, I mean, sure, but when it comes to history, you're not always going to have data. What that means is that in some cases, you're going to have to default to the experiences recounted by the people living at the time. And when we're talking about black slaves, almost all of them say that they had faced brutal corporal punishment. We have accounts from slave masters themselves recounting the use of corporal punishment. And there were even laws in the books in the South that required corporal punishment as punishment for slaves. But I guess we can't listen to that because, according to alternative hypothesis, they're only anecdotes. Listen, if we have to choose between data and anecdotes, we choose data 100% of the time. I agree with him on that. But when data isn't available, if we have a plethora of first-hand experiences, then it makes sense to look at them in that context. Sure, first-hand accounts aren't the best, but they aren't useless. If we don't have data available, they're one of our few substitutes.
Intuitively, it seems unlikely that slave masters would try to create open wounds in their very expensive property in an era before antibiotics, where a cut could kill you.
So he criticizes people for reading about other people's experiences, but then goes on to rely on the one thing that's worse than anecdotes, which is intuition. Sorry, alternative hypothesis, but thousands of first-hand accounts all essentially saying the same thing, first-hand accounts from slave owners themselves, and laws in the books that mandated corporal punishment, outweighs your intuition.
On top of that, black people in the US had a higher literacy rate immediately following slavery than did Russia. In 1870, Russia had a literacy rate of 15% compared to 20% for black Americans, and the continent of Africa didn't achieve a literacy rate of 20% until the 1950s.
Russia at the time was a backwards, poor agrarian dictatorship with the vast majority of the population were serfs who couldn't leave their land. Is that really the comparison you want to make in trying to justify why slavery wasn't all that bad? He also ignores how illiteracy was structurally and legally enforced in southern slave society. Numerous states outright outlawed the education of slaves out of fear that giving them an education would allow them to resist slavery. This wasn't a dynamic that existed in Russia, at least not according to my knowledge. Also, unlike Russia, illiteracy in the United States during that time period was heavily racialized. The literacy rate for whites in 1870 was about 85%, give or take, compared to the black 20%. So if blacks were treated similar to whites at the time, they should have had a literacy rate that was much higher, but they weren't treated right. Instead, laws were passed preventing them from becoming educated. He also mentions illiteracy in Africa in 1950, which is interesting, because that implies that literacy only really began to pick up in Africa after decolonization, considering the literacy rate is much higher than 20% now. Are you suggesting that education in Africa got better after Europeans left? Because that's pretty ironic, considering that you think that whites are superior.
Let's take a country, and within this country you got two groups. One is trying to break off from the other and partition and form a new country. The other has all sorts of legal advantages and really doesn't want this. They get preferential treatment in universities. The government requires that you get a certain percentage of government jobs from these people. They have set-asides. And they can freely form their own exclusive communities and exclusive organizations. While the group that wants to break off is legally prohibited from creating their own spaces. The group that wants to stay currently gets $300 billion in net wealth transfers from the other group, the group that wants to leave, and is constantly militantly trying to use their influence on government to get even more, to regularly bully any white who speaks out about this. People who are actually oppressed tend to have escape on their mind. They're not thinking about new ways of gaming the system to get more goodies that other people have to pay for, like all these black marches. They get 260 points on the SAT for being black, but that's not enough. They want more. Because despite the privileges they get for university admissions, there's still a very small proportion of people at these universities.
Okay, there's a lot to dissect here. One quick clarification though. The logical conclusion of the arguments I'm about to make aren't necessarily that all white people have it better than all black people. Nor am I arguing that there hasn't ever been a white person who's had to face discrimination or prejudice. I'm definitely sure that there are white people out there who have had to face those things. Rather, what I'm refuting is 1, the idea that this is some sort of widespread epidemic-like issue, and 2, the idea that blacks have it easier and are coddled when compared to whites. Those are the arguments I'm refuting. I am not making the claim that, again, all white people have it better than all black people.
They get preferential treatment in universities.
But this only tells one side of the story. For example, in part 1 of my response, I talk about how schools in predominantly black communities are underfunded and inadequately staffed when compared to predominantly white schools. Like, does he realize that this preferential treatment was implemented to rectify past injustices? It doesn't have anything to do with oppressing white people, since it's already easier for white people to get into good universities given the advantages that they had earlier in their educational career. Now, to be fair, I actually believe this type of preferential treatment isn't very helpful and probably ought not to be used. This is because the issue goes much deeper than just giving blacks more degrees. Rather, it has to do with the structural disadvantages that span across the entire education system, not just college. Like, regardless if you give somebody preferential treatment, they aren't going to do well in college if the high school and middle school and elementary schools they went to didn't prepare them for college. Since preferential treatment in college doesn't address that, I don't think it's all that helpful, and in fact it may be counterproductive, since it gives the right another talking point to spew. Also, by the way, there's evidence to suggest that whites get preferential treatment in universities too. Universities tend to discriminate against Asians to get more blacks, Hispanics, and whites in. Many universities may actually be discriminating in favor of white kids. Now, to be fair, what's much more plausible is that affirmative action in regards to universities isn't affecting whites at all. And we know this because in universities that have banned using preferential treatment based on race, white enrollment after the ban hadn't increased or decreased, which suggests that preferential treatment based on race in universities hadn't hurt white enrollment.
The government requires that you get a certain percentage of government jobs from these people.
This is done so that one group isn't grossly overrepresented in a job that carries out the functions of the government. So yes, if we're going to have a government, an institution that runs our society, I support that government being made up of employees that are proportional to the background of the country as a whole. Also, he needs to think about this in context. When you actually look at those who hold power in the United States, such as government officials, blacks are grossly underrepresented. Like, alternative hypothesis is literally arguing that the group of people whom hold very little political power in the United States are the ones who are oppressing the group with the most amount of political power in the United States. Also, even if we looked at the entire economy as a whole, like if we just looked at jobs in general, if every unemployed black person displaced a white person, only 2% of whites would actually be affected. And obviously, affirmative action doesn't work at that scale, not even close to that.
And they can freely form their own exclusive communities and exclusive organizations, while the group that wants to break off is legally prohibited from creating their own spaces.
I'm not entirely sure if I understand what he means by legally prohibited from creating their own spaces, since, if he and his white nationalist friends want to get together in a private space, they aren't legally prohibited from doing so. Or, well, at least according to my knowledge. If he's going to say that white nationalist organizations are illegal in the United States, well, the fact that there exist white nationalist organizations right now negates that. So, I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure what exactly he's specifically arguing here, so I can't really formulate a good response to that.
The group that wants to stay currently gets $300 billion in net wealth transfers from the other group, the group that wants to leave.
I traced this back to his blog, and essentially he's saying that minorities are more likely to use welfare and thus white tax money is going to them. Which, sure, but all this means is that blacks and Hispanics tend to be poor. You do realize that anti-poverty programs help poor whites too, right? Hey, guess what? Poor people make hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth transfers from rich people. Does that mean it's actually the poor oppressing the rich? No. And similarly, just because poor blacks receive redistributive money from wealthy middle-class whites doesn't mean that poor blacks are oppressing whites. Also, even if you got rid of minorities, you can't escape the logic of capitalism. Those wealth transfers will still exist, but they'll just be going from rich whites to poor whites. Why? Well, we live in a system where structural inequality is the norm. Unemployment, for example, under capitalism exists as a necessity, since 1, it has to exist in order to scare workers into being obedient, and 2, a reserve army of labor is necessary for the creation of startup companies. Similarly, low-paying jobs are necessary under capitalism, since in order to make a profit, the capitalists must pay the worker less than the value of their labor, which leads to structural inequality since wealth is pumped upward. This leads to another point. We live in an economic system where we have more than enough houses for everyone, but there are still many homeless people, where the capitalist class owns the majority of the wealth and make the majority of the money, while wages are stagnant and about 15% of the population is impoverished, and 45 million rely on food stamps, and 1 in 5 kids are impoverished. Hell, if you want to expand the scope, 82% of all newly generated wealth around the globe goes to the richest 1% of the globe. Millions go hungry around the world, yet we have more than enough food to feed everyone. So, who do you think are actually the ones gaming the system? The ones who are incredibly wealthy and maintain a system of criminal and perpetual inequality, or one of the poorest groups in America? I'll let you decide.
They get 260 points on the SAT for being black.
Oh, fun. The SAT myth. This myth originates from a study from Princeton University. What they found was that if you were to quantify all of the preferential treatment minorities receive in admission to top-tier universities, it would be equivalent to receiving an extra 260 points on the SAT. It's not that blacks get 260 bonus points on the SAT. It's that if you wanted to measure the preferential treatment minorities receive, it would be equivalent to receiving 260 points on the SAT. Hey, guess what? Athletes get 200 bonus points on the SAT, and children of alumni get 160 bonus points on the SAT. And hey, also guess what? White Americans get bonus points on the SAT too in order to help them be equivalent with the Asians. Oh wait, no they don't, because those measures are meant to be metaphorical. Another interesting find from this study was the importance of race in considerations has actually been decreasing over time. Although, to be fair, this study is quite old, so that could have changed. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that the study mainly looked at elite schools, so many of the students here, regardless of race, had already relatively high SAT scores. Now, like I said, I don't support universities giving preference based on race. I don't think it's effective. But saying blacks receive extra points on the SAT is still false. That measure was meant to be metaphorical, it wasn't meant to be literal. The stuff he mentions is quite trivial compared to the disadvantages blacks have had to face in the United States throughout history. We already mentioned police violence, disparities in the criminal justice system, bad schools, redlining, slavery, segregation, and Contrapoints' video mentions even more examples that not only harmed blacks in the past, but still either have a direct or indirect effect today. So, no, whites do not have it worse than blacks in the United States. Lastly, he talks about how white people are the ones who want to break away and that black people want to game the system, and thus it's whites whom are really oppressed, since oppressed people seek escape. But I have three responses. One, if you were to ask white people, I'm pretty sure the vast majority don't want to break away and form an ethno state. The only people who want to do that are white nationalists who don't represent the views of the majority of whites. Two, this idea of oppression needing to be coincided with escape is arbitrary. Like, oppressed groups don't always have places or the means to escape. Like, where the fuck are black people in the United States going to go if many of them did want to escape? Along with this, escape isn't the only valid response to oppression. Like, why isn't an attempt to change a system of oppression from within not a valid response to marginalization to alternative hypothesis here? Why isn't fighting oppression on the home front not valid? I mean, it seems to me that they all have the same motivations behind them. And lastly, you mentioned earlier that blacks weren't really all that badly marginalized in the United States historically, but one thing that was pretty common during both slavery and Jim Crow was black people attempting to escape. So, since they were trying to escape, are you conceding that whites did in fact severely oppress black people? Alright, so I'm done with my response to alternative hypothesis. Thanks for listening and have fun. See ya.